Hello, and welcome back to the channel if you're returning. If you're new, welcome to the channel. My name is Ricky Fraley, and on this channel we like to discuss true crime, so thank you for joining me at the edge of the void so that we can gaze into it together and hope that it does not gaze into us. This week we'll be talking about the case of the Coca-Cola Thallium murder. This case revolves around two separate neighboring families, the Trapals and the Carrs. So, diving into the Trapals first. George Trapal was born in 1949 as the only son of a New York City policeman. He graduated from the University of South Carolina in the year 1972 with a degree in psychology. He was a chemist and a computer whiz who, along with his wife, Diana Carr, who was in no way actually related to the neighboring family, the Carrs, in this story, at least in this case, Diana Carr was an orthopedic surgeon. They together moved to their home in Alturas, Florida in the early 1980s. George would write computer programs for a job, and both him and his wife actually belonged to Mensa, which, if you don't know, it's basically a group for people who have very high IQ scores, basically amongst the top 2% of the population. So they were very intelligent, at least in the way that you can test for in an IQ test. As George had no official occupation, even though he was coding for a living, he had no official occupation, no place of work. So it is believed that the couple lived mostly off of his wife's Diana's earnings. However, it would later be discovered during the investigation that Trapal himself had been sentenced prior to 3 years in federal prison back in 1975 for his involvement in running a narcotics ring. This narcotics ring was in North Carolina, and he manufactured methamphetamine. He was a real Breaking Bad kind of guy, only he got caught. One key thing to note is that George Trapal would have been familiar with the element thallium, as not only was he familiar with chemistry, as I said, he was a chemist, but in the production of methamphetamine, you use a chemical named, or the chemical thallium nitrate. So he was at least aware of the element, the chemical thallium. Friends of the couple during the investigation would reveal that the couple would stage annual Mensa murder mystery weekends. So they were, I guess, fans of true crime, like Agatha Christie kind of murder mystery, almost like kind of like an escape room. Or if you're on YouTube, you've probably heard other true crime channels talk about Hunt a Killer, where it's you get a box every month. I'm not sponsored, by the way. I'm not important enough for a sponsorship, but you get a box, I guess, and you are there to kind of solve the crime. It puts you in the place of a detective. That's basically what they were doing these murder mystery weekends, but these were by invite only, so the couple would have to invite you specifically for you to be able to be there, and it was open for Mensa members only. In these weekends, fictional murders were all poison-induced, which is important, and guests would be led through clue by clue investigations in order to solve the quote-unquote murders of the murder mysteries. So, moving on to the second important family in this case, that is the Carrs, alright? So I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this name, but Peralin, called Pi Carr, and Peggy, his wife, Peggy Carr, got married in 1988, and Peggy would move in with Pi that same year that they got married. The couple also resided with Travis Carr, which was Pi's son, and Dwayne Dubberly, who was Peggy's son. So they each had a son, and in this union, I guess they were stepbrothers. Pi would renovate their garage into an apartment where his two daughters, Jelena Shiver and Tammy Reed, lived alongside the couple's granddaughter, Casey Bell. Now, I know this is a lot of names, and I apologize, but that's just how it is. Alturas was a small town in Florida. It was a rural town as well, and as such, the family lived in such isolation that the Trapals were really their only neighbors. There were frequent arguments and altercations and disagreements within the Carr household, amongst the various children in the house due to them all being in their teens and early 20s, the very disagreeable time in your life. And also, despite Peggy and Pi only being married a few months, Peggy had already been suspicious of Pi, thinking that he was having an affair. So that generated some arguments as well. These disagreements would often cause altercations between the two families, as the Trapals did like their peace and privacy in their small rural town in Florida, and they weren't getting that when the Carrs were getting rowdy. So at some point in the year 1998, so the same year that that the Carrs got married and moved in together, it's unknown exactly when in 1988, but George Trapal allegedly threatened to kill one of the Carr children at some point that year. This was, however, dismissed by the family, and it was never really taken seriously. But for what's coming up, please do remember that George Trapal had threatened to kill one of the Carrs in 1988. So now, more specifically, in March of 1998, that same year, George Trapal would complain to a zoning board about Pi constructing that apartment on his property. And as a result of this complaint, Pi would be cited for a zoning violation and would then go on to abandon the project altogether. In July of that same year, 1998, Pi would receive an anonymous letter at his home which was addressed to Peggy Carr. It was spelled incorrectly for that name. Pi went by Pi, obviously, P-Y-E, but it was addressed to P-I-E, so he was calling him basically a baked pastry dessert dish kind of thing. It was P-Y-E. So anyways, it was addressed to Baked Pastry Carr, and it was a warning. He said, "You and your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you all die. This is no joke." And this is exactly what I would expect someone who thinks that they're a supervillain to talk like. The family would discuss the letter and then attribute it to being a teenage prank, however, because that's such a fantastical, out-of-left-field kind of thing. If I got a letter like that, I know that first, I guess it would freak me out because I'm just that kind of guy, but I don't think I would take it super seriously unless there were other things for me to connect it to. But at the time, I guess they weren't really connecting the dots on anything, which I don't really blame them for. Peggy, however, I guess she was kind of like me. She had her reservations about the letter, and she warned her children to be careful. The next incident occurred a few months later in that same year, 1988, in October. It occurred when Diana Trapal and Peggy Carr would get into a heated argument. The families up to this point had barely spoken to each other really, but on this day, Dana would confront Peggy's sons about playing their radios too loudly and them allegedly setting off firecrackers. But when Peggy came to her son's defense, Diana would shout, "You won't get away with this," before storming off. Again, the family would dismiss this as a non-serious threat, and their lives would go on as normal. In late October, so later that month, however, while at work at the Nicholas family restaurant in nearby Bartow, where Peggy worked alongside one of her daughters, Jelena, as a waitress, Peggy would complain of a series of strange chest pains. She would tell Jelena that it felt as if she was having a heart attack. Jelena recalled her mother saying, "My hands feel so numb, and also that my legs are just hurting so bad." This prompted Peggy to go home early. However, her youngest son would find her lying on a sofa, unable to speak, and Pi would rush her to Bartow Memorial Hospital as a result. While she lay on a gurney in the emergency room, Peggy would, I assume, write on a pad, telling the doctor, quote, "I feel like I'm on fire." Because remember, she couldn't talk at this point, so I'm assuming that she wrote it down. But she did communicate to the doctor that she felt like she was on fire. Her condition did perplex doctors, and they were unsure as to what was causing her symptoms, suggesting that it was psychosomatic, and 3 days later, once her symptoms improved, she was sent home. However, it would soon be realized that Peggy wasn't the only one that was ill, and by now, the couple's sons, Travis, who was 16 at the time, and Dwayne, who was 17, so they were teenagers. They also started to have strange complaints. They were complaining about tingling in their fingers, upset stomachs, and burning sensations throughout their bodies. Now remember, Peggy had said that she felt like she was on fire when she was at the hospital. Within days of her release from the hospital, actually, Peggy's symptoms would return, and she would be rushed via ambulance to Winter Haven Hospital, so a different hospital this time. After running a few tests, Dr. T. Richard Holster, who was a neurologist, and Dr. Robert Van Hook, who was an infectious disease specialist, would discuss Peggy's symptoms, and Holster would have a hunch that it might be related to some kind of poison that she may have ingested. Van Hook would ultimately be the one to suggest that it was possibly thallium poisoning. Now, let me go over a little bit of a history of thallium as it pertains to poison and how humans have used it in the past, right? So, thallium, as we know, is very important. It's actually in the name of this case, but it is a tasteless and odorless chemical. So, if you get it in your mouth or your nose, you won't be able to tell. It will just be like air, or solid air, because I assume it's either solid or liquid. It's not a gas, but it's a member of the aluminum family, which means it's a metal, so I was right. It's probably a solid, but it could also be a liquid like mercury. But it was discovered in 1861, and doctors began using it to treat syphilis originally, also gonorrhea, dysentery, gout, and other afflictions. But thallium had a toxic side effect. It caused nerves and muscles to shrivel and die. You don't want either of those things dying, really. By the 1960s, the chemical was used mostly as a pesticide to kill everything from cockroaches to rats. Its toxicity prompted the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to outlaw its widespread use back in 1972. Up until that point, like I said, it was used as a pesticide, but most of its use came from being used as rat poison. So, there you go, thallium rat poison. Dr. Holster would have Peggy's urine samples flown to a lab in Atlanta for testing, and ultimately this would prove, or that would confirm the doctor's theory about thallium poisoning being the culprit. While thallium is often found in very small traces in the body, Peggy had 20,000 times the normal amount in her body. Both sons also had elevated levels of thallium in their urine samples as well upon testing. Pi was very reluctant, however, to accept that his family may have been poisoned, stating, "I don't think anyone dislikes us enough to do that." Well, obviously he was wrong. However, the doctors thought otherwise and would inform the Polk County Sheriff's Department. Peggy then fell into a coma, and Pi's son Travis had been put on a respirator, as, like I said, thallium causes your nerves to shrivel and your muscles to shrivel and die. So I was affecting his lungs, his respiration, so he had to be put on a respirator, and his mother ultimately fell into a coma. She would die later on March 3rd, 1989, when Pi allowed the hospital to take her off of life support. So now we get into the investigation into Peggy's poisoning. Now we have the culprit, and we know what was doing it, or what caused it, but now we need to know where it came from, because 20,000 times the normal amount in your body is honestly kind of ridiculous. So in comes homicide detective Ernie Mincy, who was assigned to investigate the case. While investigating, Pi obviously became the first suspect because he was her husband. That's just how these things go. And also because Peggy suspected him of having an affair. So that, that's motive, right? However, lab tests would eliminate Pi from the list of suspects due to the presence of thallium in not only his, but also his daughter, Tammy, Peggy's daughter, Jelena, and her 2-year-old daughter's systems as well. Despite not being quite the lethal amounts, they still had elevated levels. Authorities had doubts that Pi would poison himself and his entire family solely to get rid of one member of the family, being his wife. Meanwhile, investigators were trying to find the source of the poison, so they retrieved and sent for analysis more than 400 items from the Carr household. These items ranged from samples from the family's well, to empty Coca-Cola bottles from the trash, to homemade pickles, ice cubes, and actual rat poison that they had. But traces of thallium would end up being found in the bottom of 4 Coca-Cola bottles taken from an 8-pack in the Carr's kitchen. As a result, the remaining unopened bottles of Coca-Cola would be taken and flown to the FBI lab in Virginia, where it was clear that the bottles had been tampered with, and thallium was found in each bottle. An FBI agent by the name of Brad Breck, or Brecka, I don't know, would subsequently join the investigation after this discovery. He would request the help of Bill Hagmaier, a member of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, also in Virginia, to work up the psychological profile for the culprit of these poisonings. His profile came out to be, and he would tell Mincy and Breck that they should most likely be looking for an intelligent white male in his mid-30s who liked to resolve conflicts without direct confrontation. Hagmaier would explain this was because poisoners tended to be outwardly passive and took pleasure in watching death from a distance, and would be the kind of people to leave a trail of threats. This caused Mincy and Breck to evaluate the one threat that the family had received back in July of 1988. That suspect, as you and I both know, would turn out to be George Trapal, their neighbor, who did not like them and would threaten them constantly. When interviewing all of the people who knew the family, only one person stood out as a person of interest, and that was George Trapal. Mincy recalled, "George told me he thought that someone wanted the Carrs to move out of the neighborhood when he was asked why someone would want to poison their neighbors." Mincy took notice of this because it was eerily similar to the tone of the note that the Carrs had received in the mail. This convinced both detectives that Trapal was indeed the person responsible. Now they just needed evidence. In December of 1988, Susan Garek would be asked to go undercover and surveil George Trapal in order to gather sufficient evidence to link him to the crime. While she initially refused, she would eventually come around and agree to do so. The operation would be named Operation Pale Horse. By April of the following year, 1989, the same year that Peggy Carr perished, the case had transitioned to a homicide case, despite both sons making recovery, as, like I said, Peggy passed away. Garek would send a letter to Trapal requesting an invitation to his annual murder mystery event, disguising herself under the name Sherry Gween. Sherry Gween was a newcomer to the area who was bored and desired an intellectual challenge. She would meet George face-to-face on April 14th for the first time, and meet him again on multiple occasions. However, during these meetings, she would become even more assured of his guilt due to small circumstantial findings that kept popping up. While he was intelligent and, as such, careful enough to not directly reveal himself responsible for the Carr's poisonings, Garek would find several instances of evidence that gave reasonable doubt. 1. During a visit to his home, Garek noticed an Agatha Christie mystery novel lying on the table, titled The Pale Horse. The novel's murderer used thallium to poison his victims. 2. While on a picnic, Trapal had casually suggested that Sherry blackmail her husband in order to get what she wanted from a divorce settlement. And 3. Another time he would say to Sherry, "I hear FTD sends poisoned flowers," when suggesting how she could take care of her overbearing spouse. I don't know what FTD is, but I really hope they don't send poisoned flowers. However, all of this evidence was circumstantial, and Garek was doubtful that she would be able to receive a search warrant with the little information that she was able to gather. In November of that year, 1989, just when detectives were starting to lose hope, Trapal mentioned to Garek his wife was transferring her practice to Sebring, and they would be renting their home. Garek immediately took this as an opportunity for a case breakthrough. She convinced Trapal to rent her the home until her fictitious divorce was finalized, and knowing her, to this point, he agreed. This allowed authorities to swab the entire home, unimpeded, and search for any piece of physical evidence which they could use to charge Trapal. Samples were taken, but no obvious physical evidence was found, like Coca-Cola bottles or bottles of poison, and by this time Gurek had been on the case for a year, and with no word from the FBI on any findings, by January of the following year, 1990, Gurek was getting quite desperate. In late January of 1990, she decided she wanted to meet with Trapal once more, hoping she could ask him directly about the poisonings. They would set up a meeting at a McDonald's in Sebring, where the couple now lived, and Gurek would have a microphone in her purse to transmit the conversation to a nearby surveillance van where the detectives listened. Gurek would tell Trapal that detectives had come by and told her of the tragedy of Trapal's neighbors in Alturas. He replied nonchalantly that someone had been poisoned next door. However, when Gurek handed him the detectives Mincy and Brecke's cards, Trapal's entire demeanor would change. Trapal would remark, "I hope I'm not a prime suspect. That could be messy." However, no further suspicions were aroused from this conversation, and Gurek was now on the verge of giving up herself. However, soon after, while on a call with Brecke, while discussing her desire to quit the case due to the strain that it was having on her own family, she would be put on hold so that he could take another call. This call would finally give the detectives and Gurek the break they were looking for. The FBI had found traces of thallium in bottles taken from Trapal's garage. On April 7th of 1990, all three detectives met with deputies from the Polk County Sheriff's Office near the Trapal's new home in Sebring. While still posing as Sherry Guin, Gurek would call Trapal in an attempt to keep him on the line while FBI agents and officers moved in. Diane Trapal would be the one to open the door to Brecke and Mincy, and once they identified themselves, they would request to speak to George. Diane was quite reluctant to let the officers in, inquiring what this visit was about. Meanwhile, Trapal, now realizing that the police were here, ended his call with Sherry, telling her to call back. Diane, at this point, was now livid, cursing the officers and blocking the entrance with her body, resulting in her being restrained by a uniformed officer, while the other agents and detective entered with a search warrant. Trapal would appear at the top of the stairs in bikini briefs, and officers would tell him to get dressed and come downstairs immediately. It was once he had been dressed and come down the stairs that he was told that he was under arrest for the murder of Peggy Carr. Gurek sat across the street in a car, watching, not wanting to reveal her true identity, at least not yet. Once both Trapals were removed from the home, Gurek and the search team would move in. In an upstairs bedroom, they found S&M items, literature, leg irons, handcuffs, whips. Downstairs, Gurek found a police manual with a chapter titled Death by Poison, and another book titled Poison Detection in Human Organs. At Gurek's insistence, the search continued, and a section of wall that was uneven at one end was discovered. Gurek was aware that he had a secret room in his old home, and she figured there would be one here too. An officer would yank at a pegboard, which would cause it to swing open and reveal a door which led to a secret room behind it. All the windows had been taken out, and the room was soundproofed. In January of the following year, that's 1991, Gurek would testify against Trapal with all of the evidence that she had gathered while undercover. The next morning, Trapal's wife Diane would angrily storm the courtroom to insult Gurek. While the defense tried to convince the jury that the evidence was only circumstantial, they would also paint their own client's wife, Diana Carr, as a suspect, suggesting that there was enough evidence to presume that she was also guilty, which stunned the courtroom and made the defense seem quite desperate. On one hand, they're arguing that the evidence can't stand up on its own to scrutiny because it's circumstantial, but they're also saying that the evidence that they have also means that she could be it, you know. The jury would withdraw at 10:10 a.m. on February 5th of that year, 1991. At 11:50, so an hour and 40 minutes later, they returned to watch the videotaped McDonald's conversation during which Gorek had told Tripal officers were onto him. The jurors returned to the jury room at 4:25 p.m. and informed the judge that they found Tripal guilty of first-degree murder and 15 other counts, which included poisoning food or water with intent to kill and tampering with consumer products. George Tripal, now 62, despite numerous appeals and motions, all denied, has an appeal pending before the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. If that one is denied, then the only place left for him to appeal to is the United States Supreme Court. But that is truly the last option, and they probably won't pick the case up anyways. He's now been on death row longer than any other condemned murderers in Polk County. The family of Peggy Carr now eagerly awaits his execution, with Pi recently telling journalists, "I still want to be there when he's executed. I don't have anything to say to him. I don't think I could control myself if I was to talk to him." Despite all of this, the guilty verdict and the multiple denied appeals and the condemnation from everybody who believes he's guilty, friends of Tripal and Tripal himself have maintained his innocence to this day. So that was truly a tragic case. George Tripal, a monster. He thought that he was going to get away with it. He could just threaten people just because he didn't like them making noise. And when that didn't work, he thought he could chase them off. And when that didn't work, he thought that he would be able to kill them and get away with it like a mastermind in an Agatha Christie novel. The Pale Horse, to be exact. But that didn't work, and thankfully, he's behind bars. I don't know what your stance is on the death penalty, and I will refrain from sharing mine, but he's at least separated from the general population as of right now. So I'm sure we can all be thankful for that, at least. So I would like to thank you all for joining me at the edge of the void this week to gaze into the void and hope that it does not gaze back into us. And as we learned about the tragic death of Peggy Carr, the goal of these videos, as always, is to keep the victims in our collective consciousness, and that is what I intend to do by sharing these stories. Not to glorify the killer, but to raise the names and the voices of the victims back into our collective conscious. So I hope you enjoyed learning about Peggy Carr and the unfortunate way in which her life ended. And I hope that you'll return again next week when I come to you from the edge of the void to talk about another true crime case. Thank you to my Patreons. All my socials are down in the description, as well as any of the sources that I used for this video. And I'll see y'all next time. Please stay safe. I love you all. Goodbye.